Hi, Misha here, and I know my job. I've got to do some AK content, at least now and again, or folks don't feel satisfied. And I get it. It's kind of what I do. But not a lot of new AKs to talk about. So I just kind of felt like shooting some of my favorites again. And talking about kind of the transition from the original AK Type 3, also known as just the AK47, to the improved AKM on what is sometimes called the Type 4 receiver. Both are in 7.62x39, which that ammo is a little bit in short supply these days. And to represent the original milled AK, I have out my Hungarian AK47. This is one of the old builds on a SLR 100H receiver done by MSC. Hungarian kit, Bulgarian milled receiver. Very fun gun. And to represent AKM, did the Atlantic Russian build, early date code here. Children's receiver, Polish barrel. Otherwise, it's Russian. And an early variant of that. So we're going to talk about, you know, AKs, do our thing here. Because again, it's kind of my job. And I will just tell you, with 7.62x39 ammo, kind of difficult to get right now. We will shoot them, but not just a ton. Hate to dip into my reserves too much on two guns that I know work fine. And I like this one so much that I actually sold my pre-banned Polytech Legend and kept this instead. I'll explain why. Therein again, these Atlantic builds, they're one of the few parts kits AKs in my collection. I try to go for mostly original factory built import type guns. But I'll explain why Atlantic, and frankly Legion USA before them, just does this right. So before we dive in, please like, share, subscribe. Don't forget to comment, and if you'd like to really help support us, check out Patreon. And you know, if you don't want to go over to Patreon, I get it, but YouTube does allow for the, what do they call it, super thanks and all that, so that's another way to help support if you like AK content. Now, these rifles might seem kind of odd choices. Peanut agrees. She just came over and started laying down on my shoes for examples. But what I tried to do is I really want to talk about the immediate transition from the original AK47 or AK Type 3 if you prefer, to the early AKM. So we're going to talk about the time frame between 1955 and 1965 at the very most. And so this one, being a very early dated kit build, is perfect for that. And I will talk about a couple of the mods I made to it. And this one here is good because when Hungary started producing these, the design was pretty well standardized after a lot of early changes. That, and I just kind of wanted to shoot both guns because they're fun. Slab side and the milled. Since Phoenix does not make 7.62x39, we're using Red Arduino standard this time. This gun is really authentic to a late AK Type 3, with a few exceptions. One, the finish. It's actually okay for a Hungarian refurbished AK-55 from the 70s, but originally the Russian guns especially, and even the Hungarians, would be a pretty high-grade blued finish with the carrier in the white. And because this is on a Bulgarian receiver, Bulgaria actually started setting up to make the AK in 56, and about 58 was starting to turn them out. It is one of the few that still make an authentic milled receiver today. It has a press and pin barrel, whereas your originals would be a very traditional screw-in barrel design. And I could have brought out my Russian build, but it's more of a representative transition between a Type 2 and a Type 3. So we're just going to do kind of a Cliff's Notes version of the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3. And we're not going to talk about the trials and adoption of the Kalashnikov, and already did a couple of full videos comparing it with the MP44. We're going to go back to 1948 when the gun was essentially selected and manufacture was moved to the Izhmash, today Kalashnikov concern, arsenal. And they were kind of doing a pre-production run that year, making a couple of thousand, and there were a few last-minute changes. For example, the barrel started off right at 16 inches, 400 millimeters. It was bumped out to about 16 and a quarter, 415 millimeters, so that they could thread it, 14 by 1 left hand. But interestingly, even though they threaded it, they just put on a muzzle nut. It was just kind of a future-proofing thing, what have you. Should also say at this time, there is no bayonet mount. They experimented with them, but didn't go with them. In the original pattern of magazine, the slab side is introduced. Now, that's not really correct for a Hungarian gun, but I wanted to show it off in the video and talk about how these came to be. And they're one of the few elements that kind of hung on from the initial Type 1, because as we know, the Type 1, which again was in limited production in 48, put into full production in 49, was on a stamped receiver. But it was not like this type of stamped receiver. Far from it, actually. It actually was more like the steel used in this slab mag. Very thick, welding spots, riveting, sure. And it was kind of based on the technology they had with the PPS-43 and a few other guns from World War II. But as we know, they had issues with it. Now, if they got a Type 1 off the production line and it passed quality control, no problem. It was good. That was peanut. But the rejection rate at the inspectors was just so high. In fact, while we don't know exactly how many were made between 1948 and 1951 when Type 1 production ended, estimates are between 80 and 90,000, under 100,000. For Soviet production, that is tiny. But it was a start. AK Type 2. This is the first machined receiver, actually very similar to the Type 3. The big differences are kind of in the lightning cuts and how it's machined back there. But Izhmash requested in 1950 that they go to a machined receiver over the stamped one. It was known technology. Yes, it was labor intensive. Yes, it used a lot of steel. But guess what? Russia had a lot of that labor and steel. So it didn't matter. What it gave them was a very sturdy gun. So there was a transition period between Type 1 and Type 2 where you have a lot of crossover of features. And then the Type 3 here was seen around 53, definitely in production by 54. And again, there's a bit of a transitional period where you'll see some Type 3s with some leftover Type 2. And that was just simplifying the machining of the receiver. They reworked the lightning cuts to be easier to do. And most importantly, they reworked this rear area. The Type 2, the folder, and the fixed stock were pretty similar. This one, they just used different receivers. We don't know how many Type 2s were made either, but estimates are 400 to 500,000, only at Izhmash. And they were, the Type 1 and the Type 2 both were only ever made in Russia. But the Type 3 here, once it was fully in production by 54, This would be the version that would start to get exported by Russia as early as 1955, hence the name AK-55 for Hungary. Also a bit darkly ironic, the first time the West really saw the AK in action was when Soviet troops were sent in to put up an uprising in Hungary in 1956, in which a couple of thousand protesters died, and even several hundred Russian troops. It was pretty bloody, pretty awful, quite frankly. Of course, no hold open on any Kalashnikov like this. But that said, yes, Hungary would set up production at FEG. Interestingly, FEG themselves would be kind of the assembler. The furniture they used was outsourced, and the receivers, the machine receivers, were actually done at a... Why do I like the SLR 100H so much? And in particular, because I've had Gordon Techs, I've had Blue Ridge, why did I keep the MSC? And probably most importantly, for those who haven't heard the story, why the hell did I keep this and sell a perfectly good Polytech Legend? I mean, it was in the box. Well, by the time AK started getting imported into America as semi-autos, no one was making the AK Type 3. The closest was Bulgaria, but even their version in the 1990s was updated. For example, it had the press and pinned in barrel, which is why this receiver does, the Bulgarian receiver. Otherwise, though, it is an authentic machined receiver, and all the other parts are original Hungarian from the late 50s, early 60s. The Legend from Polytech, the Chinese gun, it's a nice gun, but it was a replica. It was made in the 1980s to fulfill the U.S. market. And you can tell, because it too has a pressed and pinned in barrel, so you don't get that. Now, it does have a nice blued finish, I won't lie, and that's an attractive feature. I don't mind too much this one has the phosphated finish, because, again, refurbished Hungarian guns would get this finish in the 70s, and because I do have the firing line Russian Type 3 with some Type 2 feature transitional build, but I wanted as close to an import as I could get. Anyway, the Chinese gun has a more modern 3-rivet instead of 5-rivet trigger guard. It also has the stamped mag catch, and it has the cast front sight base, and I believe the gas block on it was cast too, but it's been a number of years. And maybe most importantly to me, this has the original machined recoil spring guide. The Chinese gun didn't. It had the wire type featured in like the AKM. And that, maybe along with the gas port, I shot them side by side, and I simply found this gun to be more pleasant and, frankly, even a little bit more reliable. And, of course, also cheaper, so I kept the less expensive gun that was assembled from a nice but still used parts kit, one I wouldn't worry about shooting, and sold the gun that was really more in the collector realm. No regrets whatsoever. Now, you also might be thinking, of course, the Arsenal SA-93. That's really the best imported AK Type 3 we've ever had, but even it has the modern features. I mean, we've done whole videos on it. You can check it out. Yeah, I hope you get what I'm saying. As far as this gun, the pressed and pin barrel, it is what it is. The Gordon Techs also had it. The Blue Ridge guns people thought were threaded in, but actually what they did is they welded up the pin. They basically just pinned it and then ground it flush and then welded it over and then ground that flush to simulate a screw-in barrel, because these SLR 100 receivers were all modern Bulgarian, therefore for press and pin barrels. The other thing I had to do, because again they were modern, was I cut the side of the receiver for traditional sling swivel. These were not initially cut here because the more modern Bulgarian guns had the swivel on the buttstock, but of course this would not. Another thing I really liked about how MSC did it, and it's one reason I picked this over the others, it kept the original machined mag catch. It's a tiny detail, but all the others used the modern Bulgarian Arsenal mag catch. And maybe it's just because I was making contact with it all the time. I could feel it. I don't know. Nice trigger in it. Also, this one still has the notches for the bayonet, whereas a lot of these, since they were made during the assault weapons ban, this was totally ground off. The nut is lightly tack welded on. I could very easily undo it, but why? I would leave the nut on anyway, so no harm, no foul there. Everything else is good. This is, of course, the Hungarian sling. The Russian slings were canvas, early were canvas with a bit of leather trim. And the whole story behind the SLR 100H is kind of neat. Intrak imported AK-55 parts kits out of Hungary, and they imported these receivers. And they basically gave 4 companies, Gordon Tech, Blue Ridge, MSC, and Ohio Ordnance, contracts to build 600 using the receivers and kits that Intrak would provide. And then they would evaluate which they thought was best and top business, and then someone would get a contract to build more. In the end, Gordon Tech would win, and they would build a few thousand. Blue Ridge would continue building them, making around 1,500, because Intrak was still just selling these virgin receivers. In fact, several other companies use these receivers, including Vector Arms later on, to build different guns. And of course, Ohio Ordnance would continue on, but actually MSC would go out of business right after this. This all happened around 2001, 2002. MSC would go out of business around 2003. To me, even though they all built roughly the same number, I don't know. It's just kind of the one you don't see the most. That, and it just, at least mine here, cycles really well and is really smooth. And I'm really quite happy with it. This gun has the original barrel. The Type 1, it was not chrome lined. And when the Type 2 came around, it was still not chrome lined. But sometime during the Type 2's run, and definitely by the time of the Type 3, they were chrome plating the bore, the chamber, and the gas block, part of the gas system. Now, Russia had already done some chroming with the PPSH-41 during the war. And I believe some of their machine guns, like the SG-43, were. And you can see this mirrored with the SKS. This is actually one reason why Tula did not make this. They were given the SKS production just in case. Although, interestingly, ISHS did make the SKS for 2 years, 53 and 54. No one knows exactly why. But by the late 50s, the AK Type 3 was being exported and licensed production was being set up. And this magazine disappears. The slab side mag was only ever made at Izhevsk in Russia. And why did they get rid of it? Weight. This mag, built with the kind of early stamp technology, is heavy. Basically a pound unloaded. And then over a pound of ammo in it. I kind of did some quick napkin calculating. The pouch they originally issued with these was a kind of heavy-duty canvas. Once you had 5 fully loaded mags in that pouch, it weighed over 11 pounds. Not the gun, just the pouch. Yeah. And then the gun itself here was roughly 9.5 pounds unloaded. Which, compared to World War II guns, well, not so heavy, but, I mean, it's looking a little heavy. And I'm mentioning this because that really explains how we shift over to the AKM and some of the issues that soldiers were reporting with the original AK-47. The first couple we've already touched upon. This machine receiver was sturdy, but it was labor-intensive and resource-intensive to make. And also the weight. And you would think, because of all that, it would be kind of light recoiling. And it wasn't bad in single shot mode, but in full automatic, it tended to climb really more than you would think for considering 760 by 39. The first change would come with the introduction of the bayonet lug here. Originally, the Type 1 didn't have it. They experimented with it, but sometime during the Type 2 run, it would be introduced by basically just cutting notches under the sight base. And by the time of the Type 3, this was now a standard thing. And a lot of older Type 2s had the cuts made during refurbishment. And even some Type 1s might have as well, although less common. We'll talk about the bayonets together here in just a minute. One of the first things they did to try to address weight was to improve the magazines here. And now let's try a rib mag, which frankly would have been the ones made in Hungary, and some old Wolf I still have. Around 1954-55, this style of magazine began to be replaced with this style. And this is a Russian one, and just picking them up by hand. This is significantly lighter, still stamped in welded steel. They're using thinner gauge, and to make up for that, they're putting ribs in it. And the ribs actually do a couple of other duties you wouldn't always think of. This is a very slick-sided mag, is what it is. Works fine. Very durable, very dependable. You could run it over with a vehicle and be fine. But if you had gloves on and things were cold, for one, it could be a little slippery. I will point out this one has a paint finish. This was done in Russia during a refurbishment. The original ones were pretty high gloss blue, so they could be a little slippery. Well, introducing ribs helped with that. Also, sometimes in the dark or during the duress, soldiers would pick this up and not know which end was up and try to, put it in the wrong way. What guy hasn't done that? So this unique pattern down here, and of course this up here, it gave them a pretty easy way to identify bottom from top, even if you're wearing relatively thick gloves, not to mention visually. Yes, these were the mags introduced about halfway through the Type 3's production run, and these would be the ones that would be manufactured outside of Russia in places like Hungary. As the AK Type 3 is going into full production at Izhevsk, and Russia is starting to market it to other nations, as it started to really get in the hands of soldiers, the Ministry of Defense in the USSR is really putting out specifications for its update, its replacement. How many Type 3s were made in Russia by Izhevsk? Again, we don't really know numbers, but 2.5 million, maybe upwards of 3 million. Certainly a lot more than the 2 and definitely the 1. But its manufacturing was limiting and slowing things down, and it just wasn't delivering everything they thought it could. And you would think, well, the AKM, they would just move over to it, right, as just a straight replacement. No, they actually had trials lasting years. Specifications were laid out, and it wasn't just Kalashnikov's team at Izhevsk that submitted a design. In fact, they may not have submitted the best design, but they probably submitted the most well-rounded design and one that soldiers were already pretty familiar with because of the previous gun. But Tula and Kovrov also submitted their designs, and each of them for a year or two were tested at the factory before submitting them for state trials. They would basically test them for durability, longevity, accuracy, all the things they were looking for. And once they were satisfied at Izhevsk, and Tula and Kovrov for that matter, they would send samples for state trials. And it would be a slow but steady process beginning around 1956-57 And that would culminate with this gun being adopted is the AKM, essentially the modernized Kalashnikov in 1959. So it was just not a straight foregone conclusion. In fact, this had to pass some pretty rigorous standards. For example, as part of this testing, it had to go 600 rounds without a failure. And they would fire 3 or 4 mags through it without letting it cool down to make sure it wasn't susceptible to heat. Testing would have it as low as 50 degrees below in Celsius and 50 degrees high in Celsius. So a 100-degree range to see if it would work and whatnot. They would also do sand, dust, mud, ice, salt water, foggy, murky conditions. And then after that, not only did it have to work, it couldn't really corrode. And of course, it had to meet certain accuracy and reliability standards trying to address the issues that they had. And it needed to be cheaper and faster to mass produce with the technology that Russia had really been developing in the 1950s. And that really explains what we see here with the AKM. Again, the rib mag was really a carryover from the late AK Type 3, but almost every other part in this gun is different and hopefully updated and improved or at least streamlined for mass production. The AKM is considerably lighter than this original one here. These were, again, 9.5 pounds unloaded. Thanks to multiple changes, the AKM was 7.5 pounds unloaded, again, kind of depending on the variation. And yes, going from the mill to the stamped receiver was a big deal. And this is a lighter, more modern version of a stamped receiver versus the Type 1. The front trunnion and originally the rear trunnion, they're both still machined or forged. The top cover is thinner, but much like with the magazine, it's ribbed for strength. And the barrel, while it's still 16.25 inches, still 14 by 1 left hand, it's a much lighter profile throughout. Also, while the original AK had chrome lining, and they might have played around with it during its production run, with the AKM, has introduced cold hammer forging technology to make these barrels. And this was just another win-win. For one thing, they could make a barrel much faster, much more consistent, and more durable with better barrel longevity. And they got this technology from essentially technology captured from East Germany after World War II, because the Germans in the war really got cold hammer forging up and going to try to improve production. And in many other ways, they found other places to save weight, but not all. For example, the original version here still had a non-lightning cut carrier, and we still don't have the lightning cut on the front sight base, and even the gas block here is not lightning cut, as we'll see later. So they kept finding places to shave off a little weight here and there. And a lot of these would appear between 1962 and 1965. Once we hit about 65 at Izhevsk, production more or less stabilizes. A key modernization introduced with the AKM that had nothing to do with weight or even ergonomics was the barrel. As we've already talked about, the original ones were screwed in, much like the SKS and RPD and many other guns before it. Perfectly good technology for the 1930s and 40s, but it was pretty labor intensive. It was more difficult to set headspace, and you had to really be sure your front sight and your gas block lined up properly. Because what if, for example, the headspace wanted to time it out at, say, 2 o'clock, but then they would be off in, when you're first putting a barrel on, it just made things more complicated, even if it's kind of old world craftsmanship. So yes, with the AKM, the pressed and pinned in barrel was introduced, and even if it's not as elegant in every other way, it is superior. And that's why for even nations that continued using the milled receiver, like Bulgaria, and were reproducing it like China, the one modern feature they would almost always carry over was the new barrel system. For one, you can just do it with far less labor. Just set up a fixture and get your barrel ready to go, ram it in, and shift it front or back, get the headspace set, drill the pin, Bob's your uncle, there you go. It also makes pulling the barrel, replacing the barrel easier, and setting headspace on a new barrel easier, or adjusting headspace later if necessary. And it works well with the new trunnion system, where you have the forged trunnion riveted into the 1mm stamped receiver, and of course the rear trunnion riveted in as well. Alrighty, time for the AKM. Starting off with red standard again, standard, and the proper rib mag. Unlike with the original, these would also be made at the Tula Arsenal, beginning around 1960-61 with low rate, and by 62-63 Tula was at full rate production. Isheskin, like I said, would start making them in 59, but it's still pretty low rate. In 1960, they would really go to full rate production. To address the kind of corrosion concerns and environmental stuff, they went from a blued finish, which is admittedly very attractive, and the bolt carrier in the white, to a paint over phosphate finish, zinc phosphate as it were. And then the carrier group would get a similar finish. Much more durable, if not as attractive, and easier to just repaint as necessary to kind of keep the underlying phosphating in good shape. Another area they were very concerned with, the ergonomics. They did actually rework the mag release and selector to make them a little easier to use, also easier to produce. But they were really concerned about that whole climbing during fire with all the recoil. So for the handguard, they added a palm swell so you could get a better grip on it. And for the buttstock, they went to a more straight back design, with just a single tang on top with 2 screws, instead of the more swept down design of the original here with the 2 tang. Which they thought would help. Now this one has the checkered pistol grip, and I will say the first AKMs built for the first few years, 59 to 61, 62, had wood grips as well. And then they would go over to the more modern Bakelite grip. They were just probably getting that up and running. One thing that's kind of funny, while they had experimented with compensators or recoil devices for a very long time, the muzzle nut would stay on the AKM really until 65, 66, and you don't even start seeing them in mass production until 67, 68, and Tula would actually be a year or two behind Ishesk. But they wanted to get it right, I think. And again, it was very easy to retrofit the new device to existing guns because from the beginning they had the forethought to put threading on the muzzle. Notice the recoil. Even though this is a lighter gun than the milled, and even though this is the early version with the muzzle nut, not the sugar scoop, the other features just make it more controllable. And finally, the bayonet system. As I said, with the original, it was very much an afterthought, but here they put a purpose-built lug on the gas block, and that was to better support the bayonet. And also because the front sight base is really quite narrow due to the lighter barrel and everything on this gun, so it just really couldn't support it. And they went to a whole new pattern of bayonet, really to address what was before. These are the 2 bayonets. This is the 6X2, or 6H2 if you prefer that translation. And this is the early version for the AKM, the 6X3 or 6H3. This one I believe is Hungarian. This one is definitively East German. And as I said, the bayonet lug for the milled AK was definitely an afterthought, and it shows. Simply cutting a couple of notches into the, really what was the cleaning rod retainer, putting a loop back here to mount it to the gas block. The blade is still very similar to the SVT-40s though. It actually makes for quite a decent bayonet and dagger, giving a reasonable range. And it is lightweight, but that grip, oh that grip, even using it as a regular knife, not to mention anything else, no, it's not there. So when it came time for the AKM, they put a lot more thought and effort into it. And it shows with the bayonet itself. The grip was meant to be much more ergonomic. Polymer grip. Of course, we have saw teeth here. We have kind of a hooked tip for prying things, getting into things. And of course, we have the little window cut in for the famous feature of it being a wire cutter here. Get in there. Chomp down. That's why they went to a synthetic grip. And the rubber insulator here in case you needed to cut electrical fences, which, you might wonder how often that happens, but actually U.S. troops used that feature with their Frobus M9s in 1989 in Panama, so it does happen. Otherwise, we have a stainless steel blade, which is, corrosion resistant. Lug's a lot better thought out too, being located on the gas block, just with a much more secure mount. And also easier to remove. You just reach up here and grab it. Only downside, you have a slightly shorter blade, meaning slightly shorter overall length, and it's much more of a utility knife than just a strict bayonet, strict dagger. So this is a little bit less useful as a bayonet compared to the original. But in every other way, the X3 is superior to the X2. Again, dismounting, you have to kind of reach up here, you get a small little thing to pull down. Whereas on the AKM, you just got a button, reach up with your right hand typically, slides right off. Moving on to some other maybe more subtle but still important changes, they really moved the sling mount back from here to here, and from here on the side of the receiver to back on the stock. This was done because some soldiers complained about the ergonomics of carrying it, especially on long march, long patrol. They also went from an 800-meter rear sight, which is already very optimistic on the original, to a 1,000-meter rear sight. Okay. And I will say that's one part I did replace on this gun. The original had the teeth on the right side, so you push the button in from the left, and they moved it over to the right during early days of production so that it wouldn't get accidentally hit when it was slung. And when I got this gun that was built from a kit, it had the updated sight on it, and I kept it, of course, because they went with the kit, but I found a pretty appropriate AKM style left notch sight, and that's why they did it. This happened around 62, 63 when they switched the sides over. That and the pistol grip are the two major changes I made to this, and even that, they're pretty small. But otherwise, the gun was pretty good to go. Unlike with the original milled AK Type 3, for the AKM, we do have some import options. The Egyptian Mahdi is a very good example of a late 60s, early 70s Tula. And the Romanian Kuger, say SAR-1 or Wasser 10, is a really good example of a slightly altered variation, but still very, very close to AKM spec. And heck, there are some Hungarian imports like the SA85 that are still getting a little further away, but close enough for most people. And in more modern times, you have the Polish WBP AKM, which again, still very close to original for most folks. But there is something to be said for those Russian markings, even to me, who's blind. And if you want a Russian AKM, I'm going to be honest, a Saiga converted won't do. A Saiga, as I've said in multiple videos, is an AK100 series. In every way, just as the original 47 differs from the AKM, the 100 series differs from this by 2 generations, with the 74 in between them. Now, the only way to do it is to build it from a kit. And luckily, in recent years, really over the last 10, 15 years, we've been blessed to have quite a few nice Russian parts kits come in. Some of them are mismatched, some of them are matching. Unfortunately, because of the barrel ban that was in effect from 2005 to potentially this year finally being lifted, they didn't have their barrels and, of course, no receivers. But since these are standard AKM bits, bobs, anything like a Romanian barrel, Polish barrel, or even several high-quality U.S. barrels are available, and you really can't tell the difference. And as far as the receiver, Nodak has always made, or Morrissey, good ones in America, but when the Childress came out, and a lot of people like the AK builders too, either way, they're very nice. They have proper shaped dimples. They have the XY stamps here. And they just feel right. I believe the first Russian kit build I had was from Velocity Firearms, although I bought it through Atlantic. That was around 15 years ago. It was okay, but nothing special. Now, the first really good one I picked up was that Legion USA build, which was on a Childers and with the FB Raiden barrel. And at that time, I had them do a late kit build because I wanted late features. But then another batch of kits came in, and actually I got my hands on, through trade, one of the Palmetto State guns that had an FN barrel and on their receiver, and I really tried to like that gun. Did a full review on it, but it just wasn't quite there for me. A few things were off about the cut of the receiver. The FN barrel had those big old markings. There were just a few things. And considering it was the same money as the Atlantic builds, and I just kind of generally trust Atlantic a little more, again, for same money, this is what I would go with. And I really got lucky getting an early build. I mean, I requested it, but that doesn't mean anything. And this is it. I don't know how I could do a better job outside of having the original Russian barrel and Russian receiver. Some people complain about the finish. You can if you want. I'm going to be honest, the paint finish on Russian guns changed over time. The paint they used in 1959 was not the exact same paint they used in, say, 1977 when AKM production ceased. Either way, you can always repaint if you want. But even after getting this gun in, I wasn't 100% sure until I took it out here to the cabin and shot it for the first time. Let's start off with Cellar and Bella. Much like with the gun up here, once I shot it, I knew this is where I was at because I just really enjoyed how it felt. It felt right. What does that mean? I don't know. All I can tell you is shoot AKs for 3-4 decades and you know when things feel right. And this one does. And it's held up well over the year and some change that I've had it. They also reworked the gas system a bit, moving the ports from the tube to the gas block itself, and now they're more symmetrical. And internally, they went from a double hook machine trigger group to a single hook, and they introduced what was a rate reducer, an out-of-battery safety, so that it would not fire until the bolt was fully locked in place, and to kind of keep it manageable and automatic. And unfortunately for us, that's the part the ATF decides is what makes it a no-no machine gun. It would go in this pin here, so we can't have good things like that. But it was more of a safety feature than anything else. But it helped kind of keep the recoil just a little bit down and safety up, and for the whole, targeting of automatic fire. And there are many, many other changes, and they would continue to change them for a few years. I would say in 58 into early 59, they did kind of a pre-production run, and they gave them to soldiers in the field to carry around, see how they liked the new furniture, the new ergonomics, the lighter weight, how they felt recoil and accuracy was, how the new paint over phosphate finish would hold up, before they put it into full rate production. And generally, the soldiers really liked it. And I've got a little bit of that Grom ammo left. Remember when we first talked about it, we said it was a little on the warm side, so let's see how it does. You can definitely feel it a little more than the Red Army. That said, as with anything new, and really it's kind of the same old guard we'd always expect, there were some old crusty NCOs and whatnot in the Red Army that felt the original was just more sturdy, more dependable, more reliable, and had more longevity built into it. So it would actually be a few years before the AKM could prove itself. And to be fair, with the experience early on with stamped receivers, I get it. This definitely does not feel like as nice of a gun. But it doesn't need to be. It's a tool. And it did. Eventually, it kind of won them over, so much so that when the AK-74 was introduced in its 5.45 cartridge, the old guard of the day then wanted to stick to the AKM. Why not? It was really by 65, 66 that pretty much all the Red Army, at least frontline combat units, would get an AKM. They would start off with like paratrooper units and mobile rifle brigades, essentially guys in BMPs and BMDs, and then eventually other people would get them. And of course, with both of these, there was an underfolding stock version, but that's really outside the scope of this video. Milled receivers have a reputation, a myth about being a little more accurate than a stamped. That might be true just because you have consistent rails and a nicer trigger. But on the other hand, the sweep of the stock can throw some people off versus an AKM. That is something we can debate. But the idea that this is a more durable gun that will last longer than this, hogwash. And the idea that you need a 1.5 millimeter receiver for a stamped gun to be truly durable, also hogwash. Why do I say that? How often have you heard of a 1 millimeter receiver failing? Now, I mean one that has proper heat treats. Obviously, if it's not proper, the pinholes can egg out. But to be fair, if a milled receiver is not properly heat treated, the part I've seen fail in it is the ejector, the wing that sticks out. I've seen those go wonky because they're too soft or too hard. So there's that. And of course, your bolt locks up in your front trunnion, your barrel's pinned into your front trunnion. That's really where the money's at. If your front trunnion's good, then you're good. Because while the receiver takes stress, if it's properly riveted, it'll hold up just fine. And if for some reason your stamped receiver does fail, it's a lot cheaper to replace this piece than it is a full milled piece, because this is all one chunk from front to end. You'd have to replace everything. With this, theoretically, you could pop the rivets, salvage your rear trunnion, salvage your front trunnion. There you go. But even on a military gun, the stamped receiver isn't known for failing. Like Battlefield Vegas has had Walsers go tens and tens of thousands of rounds on the original receiver. And in semi-auto, look, if you can afford that much 7.62 by 39 to wear out a stamped receiver, you can afford another receiver or whole gun. And to be fair, I think a milled would fail at about the same rate, maybe in a different area and for different reasons, but everything has a service life. And that's what soldiers found out. Even though this might not be as elegant, it was just as durable, dependable, and frankly, even a little easier to maintain at the unit armor level, a little easier to replace parts with, and frankly, the 2 pounds or so of weight savings, not to mention the magazines, accounted for a lot. You know, I said at the beginning of the video, with the slab side mags, the whole 5 mag pouch loaded up was over 11 pounds. Well, with these, they introduced a 3 and then a 4 cell pouch, so they reduced the number of mags and thus the number of rounds. They did try out the alloy waffle mags and built them in reasonably large numbers, but they were never standard issue. But in '68, the Bakelite mags came out, and those further reduced weight while still keeping a very reliable magazine. And so they were able to not just make the gun lighter for the soldier, but the magazine pouch he had to carry lighter as well. Several dozen nations used the original AK-47, and a little over half a dozen had domestic production set up. China, North Korea, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, of course, I'm holding one right here, Bulgaria, quite famously, so on and so forth. And a few million were made. Not at all a small number, but it was the AKM that really pumped it up. Over 100 nations use these in some capacity, and well over a dozen nations had domestic license production. For example, Romania would use the original 47, but they would hold off producing them until the AKM. And of course, this gave the Soviets a way to get better influence with the nations they wanted to. They would go over, they'd send advisors and all that. Egypt is a great example. They set up the whole factory in Egypt, and that gave them an in there until they were finally kicked out around 73. But this became such a symbol of the communist bloc, and even though it kind of knocks you in the shoulder back a bit, it still doesn't have a lot of muzzle flip. Yeah, that sounds a nice trigger. Because it is a damn good gun with a lot to recommend it. And this is really what people think of when you say AK. Some might think of the AK-47, the original. Some might think of the AK-74. But it's the AKM that really put it on the map. And well over 10 million were made within the USSR, give or take. Most of them came from Irshevsk, 7-8 million, with Tula making another 2 million, maybe 2.5 million. But then you get production from Romania, Poland, East Germany, who made more than you would think, Egypt, and China. Oh, Lord, China. Now, did they actually make an AKM in China? No, because relations between Russia and China had fallen apart by this time. But they made their own variant on a stamped receiver of the Type 56, and if we want to count those as kind of an honorary AKM, it really goes up to the point we don't know. Obviously, North Korea made an unlicensed copy too that I've done a video on in the past. We don't know how many AKMs were made, but it's in the tens of millions. And there were several cool variants besides. And I think this one here is a really good example. Nice condition kit. Numbers matching. It does have a Russian sling on it. I do have a Russian mag in it. And even though the receiver is actually made from a Polish blank, the tooling was set up in Poland by Russia. And the barrel, again, that was made in Poland, it was made to Russian specs. And if anything, I would say the FB Radom barrels are probably equal or superior to Irshevsk barrels. And a lot of people like the Tula made guns too. I get it. They're neat. But my thought with this one was, I already have a Mahdi, which is pretty much a Tula. So having an Ishas would be pretty cool. And this one being an early build. It just has some unique features that you don't see on a lot of other AKMs. But what do you think? I'm really curious which ones you like. You know, kind of asking someone to pick their favorite AK make and model is, it's almost like a personal question. It's like Ford or Chevy or anything else. Definitely a smoother throw. And a nice trigger on this. This is much more kind of rattly and crunchy. Trigger is fine, but nothing to write home about. However, even though this is roughly 2 pounds lighter, I would say, especially when you're trying to rapid fire, it doesn't want to climb as much on you, and that's without the sugar scoop. If you put that simple little brake on, it helps a little bit. But it's not on this gun because it would not have been the norm when it was originally created. Early days of the AKM, and really when you see why the changes were made, they were very logical. And this gun went through quite a bit of trials and testing. By the way, the furniture, I know when everyone kind of likes the Russian red. Well, that's definitely true. It's kind of that iodine lacquer. It's a kind of a laminate Arctic birch wood. The original 47 here, now of course this is Hungarian, so it's got Hungarian wood, but even the Russian 47s, they did not have the red wood. Some had hardwood, some had laminate, but they had more of a brown to kind of golden blonde color. They had not introduced the red iodine shellac yet. And one of the reasons they introduced it was, again, moisture barrier, corrosion resistant. Plus, you know, even Russians had aesthetic sensibilities. But yeah, 2 guns I just enjoy shooting. Only wish the ammunition were more available and more cheaper. Well, I appreciate you tuning in today. There's just something to be said about a bog standard, traditional AKM. And these are done right. From the correct spec receiver that just feels natural when you go to charge it, to having the right size gas port that's not overly thumpy, to nicely assembled parts, attractive wood furniture. As I said, I changed just a couple of things about it, namely the pistol grip and the rear sight, just to be a little more early. And if you can't get Russian parts, there's absolutely nothing at all wrong with the Polish equivalents, because they're made exactly to the same spec. A lot of fun. Very nice light gun. But a lot of customers have reported to me before they ever fired a traditional milled AK and then did so, just how impressed they were. I don't think they realized just how smooth an AK bolt throw could be, or how nice the original milled double hook trigger was. The steeper decline on the stock, that's kind of a personal choice thing. The slab handguards, a little bit of a personal choice thing. And the added weight, it is a double-edged sword. And as we pointed out at the beginning, even though this does weigh more, it also kind of has a little more muzzle flip. Not exactly more recoil, just more flip than the AKM. But this is a different era of an AK, and it shows. So if you haven't ever fired the original AK47, do so, because you're absolutely missing out, and it's a whole thing in and of itself. So happy to bring this back out today and share it with you guys. As always, please do like, share, subscribe. Would love to hear about your own AKMs or AK47s or AK74s or RPKs, whatever, in the comments. Let me know what you're thinking of the ammo. Have you bought some of the Grom ammo? Been very happy with it. It seems to be very solid, very mil-spec, and we haven't had any corrosion issues after almost half a year, so take it for what you will. But yeah, that's my AK content as it is right now. I hope something does happen to give us more to do, but in the interim, we're just going to enjoy what we have already. If you could help support the channel on Patreon, that'd be greatly appreciated. If you can't, though, we understand. Just being here, sharing time with us, that's awesome, too. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.